I think that's one of the things we get criticized for in nutrition is that an article comes out, it says eggs cause diabetes. Another one comes out and says eggs don't cause diabetes, because the work is so complex and it may vary from one population to another population.
Mm-hmm.
So the media really shouldn't take the results of a single study, even if it's Framingham or the Nurses' Health Study or anything. Even though they found an association in one study, it doesn't mean it's true for everyone. Only relatively recently has the NIH even acknowledged that we need research in these diverse populations. Almost all of our cohort studies have been white. I was so surprised to see that farmed fish, for example, concentrate dioxins. The same fish that are giving you the good omega-3s also have these toxins in them.
Hello, folks. Welcome to Research Meets You by Beauty Reapplied. Today we have Dr. Katherine Tucker on board today with us. Truly an honor to have you here. Before we get started, I'd love to give some context and background for our listeners. Dr. Katherine Tucker is a world-renowned expert in nutritional epidemiology. She serves as a distinguished university professor and researcher at UMass Lowell with over 500 scientific publications. Dr. Tucker's research has had a profound impact on understanding how diet affects chronic diseases, especially among underserved populations. She's also the principal investigator of the Boston Puerto Rican Health Study and has held leadership role on the Food and Nutrition Board, the National Academies of Sciences, and as editor-in-chief of Advances in Nutrition. So before we start, would you mind giving us a little bit more of your background and what led you to pursue a career in nutritional epidemiology?
Thank you so much for having me on. I've been interested in diet and health ever since I was in high school. And so I started there just reading on my own. And then when I got to University of Connecticut, I realized you could major in nutrition. So I was very happy and loved the field. From there, I went to the Peace Corps in the Philippines. So there I worked in health centers where there was severe malnutrition. I saw things like vitamin A deficiency where the children had white spots for blindness from vitamin A deficiency and malnutrition from inadequate protein. And so I became even more motivated to work with nutrition. And I came back to Cornell, did my PhD, also in global nutrition. I worked in Panama, looking at diet and child growth at that time. And then when I went to Tufts University, Human Nutrition Research Center on Aging, it's funded by the USDA. And so I had to work in the US, but my orientation from my experiences was very much disadvantaged populations. And so I started, though, before I was able to get into my own funded work on, as you'll hear, the Puerto Rican population in Massachusetts. I started with the Framingham Heart Study, working with those data. And so I was actually very impressed when I started working with the Food Frequency Questionnaire diet data there and the health outcomes that are available in this rich data set, that there was so much relationship between micronutrients and health outcomes that hadn't been studied. The emphasis had been so much on fat and fiber and macronutrient distribution and all of that. But micronutrients had, other than, deficiency diseases like vitamin A in other countries, at that time, there hadn't been a whole lot done. And so we were finding amazingly strong relationships in Framingham. And so from there, I've just continued with other populations.
I know we're going to get into the whole Boston Puerto Rican study, but before we jump into that, I'm kind of interested in knowing how's your experience at the Food and Nutrition Board of the National Academies of Sciences?
Yeah, the Food and Nutrition Board is the institution, the independent institution in the U.S. that oversees the dietary requirements, the DRIs. And so they form committees to both create those DRIs, but also to answer other questions that are of interest to maybe government agencies that will ask for a study on a certain topic. So it was a wonderful experience. I was involved with them for 2 terms, and I worked on committees. For example, one was to understand dioxins in the food supply, where I was so surprised to see that farmed fish, for example, concentrate dioxins. The same fish that are giving you the good omega-3s also have these toxins in them, and how to balance that. I worked on a committee to improve standards for the child and adult food programs. And so we reviewed what the recommendations were and how to update those. Also worked on things like workshops to improve the understanding of diet and aging, and we created a little booklet on that. And more recently, on methods, the use of meta-analysis for nutrition policy, which was commissioned by the FDA because they need to, understand more about nutrition. They've been focused on drugs, but more and more with the supplements and things like that, they need to understand how do you synthesize the evidence in order to make those decisions. And most recently, and importantly to this conversation, I was on a committee to design approaches to considering chronic disease for the future DRIs, because the current RDAs, for the most part, recommended dietary allowances, were based on deficiency. How much do you need to replete? What do you need to have a healthy basis? But now there's a recognition that, and they were based on the healthy population.
Yeah.
But now there's a recognition that what is the healthy population if such a large proportion is obese and has diabetes? Almost every older person has something, hypertension. And so we need to expand our recommendations beyond just not deficient to how did these nutrients, as we're accumulating the evidence that we research, how did we make recommendations not only to be not deficient, but to prevent or slow chronic disease. So that was quite interesting. It's a wonderful Food and Nutrition Board's a wonderful place to put this information together, and it's taken very seriously in terms of the recommendations from there.
Oh, this is fantastic to hear. I'm sure it's reassuring to listeners to know that so much thought goes behind what comes in service to them.
Oh, yes, very detailed work.
The fish one really piqued my interest just because, as someone who eats salmon, we're in the Pacific Northwest.
Yes.
So,
Yeah, I was shocked when I started to learn how big a problem it was. And also, I don't think a lot of people realize that the dioxins, they think they're an environmental contaminant, which they are.
yeah.
But they're more concentrated in farmed fish than the fresh fish because they feed the fish Roundup fish, and it gets concentrated in those farmed fish. So it's important to know where your fish is coming from.
And
I think tilapia in Asia also has this issue.
oh, wow. Okay. So it's not just, unique to the US. It's more of a
No, it's global.
man. Okay. That's scary. Well, I'm going to stick to wild salmon.
I
But
do, but
that's great to hear. But just so some folks have context, what are the consequences of what you just described happens to the fish to us as humans?
yeah, well, dioxins are an endocrine disruptor, so they can have very negative effects on the body. Certainly, you don't want them when you're pregnant. That's
Okay.
the most important thing, or
Oh,
for
that's huge.
children,
Mhm.
because they can disrupt your hormones and cause different kinds of reactions, inflammation, and all kinds of other things in the body.
Wow.
In small amounts, of course, they're not going to do that, but we want to avoid them when we can,
Absolutely, especially during pregnancy where everything's so important.
especially during pregnancy.
It's I'm sure people would love to hear that. I didn't know that. I obviously am not getting a child anytime soon, but I feel like that should be more common knowledge.
Yes, yes. They do make recommendations for this reason for pregnant women, well, mostly for mercury,
Hmm.
but dioxins tend to follow, but in limiting large fish intake too. They don't say never eat it, but limit it and eat more of the small fish. You can get your omega-3s from things like that's it, sardines,
Okay.
or in Asia, they have very small fish that they eat a lot, and those are safer.
Okay. That's interesting. Um, I guess I don't want to spend too much time. We have so much more to get through, but I'm
Oh.
so intrigued to know why the smaller fish are better. Do you happen to know?
They don't concentrate. It's this bigger fish eat smaller fish, and every time they eat, they are concentrating these things,
Okay.
um,
That's crazy.
several chemicals in the in their flesh. Yeah.
Yeah, so sharks could be even worse if we were,
Oh, sharks are definitely worse. Yeah. Tilefish, king mackerel, you don't want to eat any of those if you're pregnant.
gotcha. Okay. That's really helpful for folks, I'm sure. And before we jump into the study again, what was it like serving as the editor-in-chief of Advances in
Yeah,
Nutrition?
that was a fantastic experience because, as you say, we want to get this information out there.
Hmm.
And I jumped on as editor in chief when the journal was just starting. It had John Setti had gotten it started, but had stepped down in a couple of years, and we still had to build the whole infrastructure and the whole system. But what's exciting about it is that we were able to recruit excellent review articles, which take all these different studies and put them together to kind of give this recommended advice. As well as we added perspectives for areas that are controversial, where someone might argue a certain point and another person might argue a different point when things haven't been fully settled. But the review articles are meant to be neutral. So we have both of those, and we were able to get a great response and grow the impact factor, showing that people were reading it in a really great way. So I'm very proud of my work there.
Absolutely. It sounds like it was a startup lifestyle. You just took it to something massive what it is today.
Thank you.
I guess since you mentioned that review articles tend to be the most neutral, there are a lot of
Mhm.
folks out there, social media influencer that tend to be posting article after article suggesting this or that. So if they wanted to be more
Right.
credible, they should use the review type articles from your site.
Absolutely. I think that's one of the things we get criticized for in nutrition is that an article comes out, it says eggs cause diabetes. Another one comes out and says eggs don't cause diabetes because the work is so complex and
Hmm.
it may vary from one population to another population.
Hmm.
So the media really shouldn't take the results of a single study,
Hmm.
even if it's Framingham or the Nurses Health Study or anything. Even though they found an association in one study, it doesn't mean it's true for everyone. And so things often need to be put into context, which is why we don't really make policy based on one or two studies. And the review articles take the bulk of them and they say, well, 5 studies found this and 4 studies found this. But the 4 studies tended to be weak, they were small in design. So we kind of believe 5 studies. And so the review article will put what's available out there. And so for communicating to the public, I think you're right. Review articles are the way to go.
Yeah, it's always something that bothers me is when someone comes up to me like, "You can't be eating that because I saw a study." Like, no,
One
I'd rather.
study is not clearly transferable to everybody. No.
Yeah. And that's a great turning point or a nice point, conversation, which is the Puerto Rican population, because
Mhm.
that's a very specific subset that has not been reflected as you found in your research. So,
Right.
how have your findings kind of shaped our understanding of diet-related disparities in populations?
Well, when I was, working with Framingham and understanding these links between diet and health and having that background in global nutrition where people have real nutrient deficiencies, I realized that our major Latino subgroup was Puerto Rican. And when you went to find out what was their status, there was nothing, because almost all the work has been done on Mexican Americans because they're the largest Latino subgroup. Puerto Ricans are the second largest, but almost nothing had been done on them when they've been included. It's been Hispanics, and they talk about the Hispanic paradox and things like that. And what I realized is that the diet of Puerto Ricans is completely different than Mexicans. They really can't be combined.
Yeah.
Plus, the profiles of risk that of the Puerto Ricans, they have higher heart disease, more hypertension, more diabetes even than the Mexican American population, and certainly limitations in their diet. So we set out to work with them as a vulnerable population. Many of them living in New England are also low income, so that makes them at risk. Not all, of course, but many. And so what we found over the past 20 years of work, we started out documenting the disparities by comparing them to non-Hispanic white adults living in the same neighborhoods. And we found twice as much diabetes, twice as much depressive symptomatology, more physical disability, more poor cognitive function. And recently we showed more osteoporosis, which people didn't really realize. They tended to think that osteoporosis is most common in white women, and there's been very little attention given to minority populations. But we, working with Framingham, realized that it's not all about calcium and vitamin D, but all nutrients. So many nutrients affect osteoporosis as well as all of these things. And so over the years, we've measured these, we've followed people up, we've measured their diet every 4 years or so and taken a look at how those relate to things. We've also measured their blood. We documented very high prevalence of low vitamin D, low vitamin B12, low N3 fatty acids, low magnesium, and what has turned out to be the most important of all is low vitamin B6. Very low B6 in the blood relates so strongly to risk of metabolic syndrome, to inflammation, to all the things in these chronic disease patterns. So we think that we've really put a spotlight on the importance of vitamin B6.
That is, wow. That's just crazy that for so long, these categories were just so large and vague. I guess that makes a lot of sense to me. Just because, in India, I'm Punjabi, and that's in the northern part, and there's another state, Gujarat, which is also on the northern half. Now, the northern half has a very different diet from the southern half, and that's usually the typical thing that's used. But the truth is, Gujaratis have an incredibly different diet from Punjabis, even though we're relatively closer than the southern part of India. They tend to have a vegetarian diet. We tend to have a non-vegetarian diet, and that has catastrophically different impacts on the biology.
Absolutely. And that is, that disaggregation, it hasn't been done because, first of all, it's difficult and expensive.
Yeah.
But if you think about it, if you mix too many things together, you might wash out a finding, that's true for a subset. And so that's what we're learning more and more is that these relationships, how does eggs relate to diabetes? Well, it depends on a lot of other things. It's not like everybody has a reaction from eggs to diabetes. It depends on everything else they're eating. It's just so complicated. And that's why nutrition epi is very difficult, very complex, and easy to criticize because there's always alternative explanations. But we're getting better and better over time and getting more confident in our results. And my years of work has done nothing but convince me that diet is probably, if not one, the major risk factor for why we're seeing such an increase in chronic disease. And it's largely due to inflammation, oxidative stress, and things that are worse if you don't have the right micronutrients to protect against them. So micronutrients, I mean, it had been all about that, but now it's really largely about micronutrients.
Yeah. Well, I'm so glad that you've been able to highlight that. It's someone I felt like that's something that's been an issue, but it's hard to say as a layman.
Yeah.
But as a researcher, it's fantastic to hear.
And I think you're absolutely right. I think one of the next really important areas are this huge population that in the National Health and Nutrition Examination Survey is grouped together as Asian, right? And obviously Chinese and Indians should not be grouped together.
And even China has so many subdivisions.
Exactly. So we need ways to be able to get at that without it being prohibitively expensive. And I think in the past it was difficult, but I think now with more technology and more AI approaches, I know a lot of people working on them. We should be able to do better in the future. We're moving towards what we call personalized nutrition.
Yeah, that sounds incredibly promising. So actually, would you mind highlighting why it's expensive for folks? What causes the cost to go up? Is it the food frequency questionnaires or is
Well,
it
yeah, the food frequency questionnaires that have done, most of the backbone work have been either by the Harvard Group or by the National Cancer Institute. And both of those were designed for the majority white, middle class American. And so they work great in the Nurses' Health Study. They work great in the Framingham Heart Study, which is middle class Massachusetts white. But they started realizing as there was only relatively recently has the NIH even acknowledged that we need research in these diverse populations. Almost all of our cohort studies have been white.
Oh, okay.
And so the first one really that they've done that I also work with is the Jackson Heart Study of African Americans in the South. I designed their FFQ2 because they realized that they had a Jackson site on a kind of mixed group study of 4 sites and used the Harvard questionnaire. But when they tested for validity, it wasn't valid in this African American group. So they realized after they heard about my Puerto Rican food frequency that they needed their own for that region. And we found so many differences like fried catfish and chicken fried steak and grits and ham hocks and gumbo and things that just, if they're not on the food list in a food frequency questionnaire, you don't capture them. So how can you expect to get valid data? So when they've tried to, add minority participants to things, even like Framingham, they had a minority cohort. They used the Willett questionnaire and they weren't able to get anything out of it because the data were not valid. So what I worry about is when you have a mixed group and there's this pressure to include everybody in your studies, which is great. But when you have this mixed group and the questionnaire is working for the majority, but it's misrepresenting the minority, you can make completely wrong conclusions. Not only weakens it, but it can tell you the wrong answer. So it's critically important to get the dietary data right with all the cultural complexity and subgroups but we really need to focus on it. In the past, nutrition hasn't been a priority for the NIH and to get something funded to develop these things is very difficult. I was funded to develop both these questionnaires by the USDA.
Oh, okay.
And when I was working at Tufts. So I was able to do it, but it was years of work.
Yeah.
Develop these. And I think we're getting faster and better with technology. And I think we can do better.
Hopefully the NIH will change and provide funding for this soon. That's
Yeah, they've been moving ever since I got started in this field, and they've been moving in the right direction. I got the Puerto Rican study was funded with outreach they had for population health and health disparities.
okay.
So they're understanding now. I mean, before that, health disparities wasn't on their radar, but now it is, and so there's more and more focus of getting this information for different subgroups.
If listeners wanted to help, motivate NIH to do this, how could they do so? Would they need to talk to their state representatives and have them reach out to the NIH to increase funding, or
Yes,
private donors?
actually, yeah, the NIH is funded by the Congress, so absolutely, that is a way to
Fantastic.
always reach out to Congress and say how important it is to support funding for the NIH because it's always vulnerable.
Yeah, it is. Our whole system is very delicate, and it's upon us as a people to kind of make sure it stays in check and remains the way it should be.
That's right.
Uh, awesome. So, we did mention food frequency questionnaires.
Mhm.
Would you mind, for folks who don't know what it is, explaining kind of briefly what it is and essentially the concept
Sure.
of it?
Right. Well, there's two kinds of major dietary assessment methods. One is what you might be more familiar if you write everything down you eat yesterday or today. So
Mhm,
that, or we ask people, what did you eat first thing you got up and what until you go to bed? That's a 24-hour recall.
mhm,
The limitation of that, it gives you the detail, but the limitation is that it's one day. And as you can imagine, if you went to a birthday party or you were fasting, that day has nothing to do with your usual intake. And so it's not going to relate to your risk of diabetes because it's just one day and it might be completely different than how you usually eat. So there was some good statistical work about 30 years ago or more showing that you need multiple days of recalls in order to get a good estimate of a nutrient, and you can get a good estimate of something like energy or macronutrients probably with the average of about 4 random days. But for something like vitamin A, where it's in concentrated foods like liver or carrots, you might be missing those at any certain day. So you need maybe up to 30 days, and 30 days is prohibitive. It's for each 24-hour recall. If you're going to be doing it with an interviewer, it
mhm.
takes at least 20 minutes per recall, usually half an hour. So for large studies, the cost of the multiple recalls is too much. They have designed these food frequency questionnaires, which are based on the 24-hour recalls. You see what are the foods contributing the most to nutrients. You make sure those are listed. They're grouped so that because you can't ask people 1,000 foods. So, the standard line on the block questionnaire, the first one was apples, pears, and applesauce. And then there might be something like chicken fried, chicken broiled, but not every single food or every single division of foods. And over time, as they started using these, they made them more and more complicated. But it's a balance between length and complexity. So if that list of foods is usually anywhere between 120 to 180 food items, and then there is on some, how frequently do you eat this? Multiple times a day, once a day, twice a week, once a week, less than once a month. And so based on those, that is linked to the nutrient database and everything's added together to get your nutrient intake. Now, in some like the Harvard, there's no portion size. They assume a portion size. That makes it even worse for minority groups because I'm sure even in the Indian diet, they assume rice as the typical American side dish of maybe 2/3 a cup, whereas some other cultures, rice is the center of the plate,
Yeah.
and they much more than that. And so when we were designing our food frequency for the Puerto Ricans, we had to not only make sure the foods are listed, but also we had some data from one Hispanic canes that had been available. So we looked at the portion sizes and showed the differences between the Puerto Rican average portion size and the usual American average portion size. And so we allowed answers of small, medium, and large so that we could tailor the portion size to get that balanced and get the right. And we found that made a big difference. It does make a big difference for when you have different cultural patterns included. So you have the food list, you have the frequency, and then you have the portion sizes. And then we link that to the National Nutrient Data Bank, which were in USDA, they bring in foods periodically and analyze them in the laboratory for their nutrient content. And so that's what informs it.
Thank you for explaining the whole thing. That's really helpful. In fact, you're probably the perfect person. Your paper assessments of unusual dietary intake and population studies of gene diet interaction kind of discusses the accuracy of assessing these different methods. So, the 24-hour dietary recall is really accurate, but you can't do it too many days because right now the whole process of having them call the interviewer costs too much, right? How much would you estimate? It's about like $100 for some folks per day.
It depending on how you do it, it could be 150 recall, something like that
per day, which is insane.
Per day recall, right? And you gotta have somebody calling them up. You've got to have it entered. You've got to pay for the software, all of that. Yeah,
it's crazy high. And then we have the food frequency questionnaire, which is a bit cheaper and kind of looks at everything on a broader scale, but you can't see exactly the ingredients they're consuming or the exact proportions. So how do you balance the need for that? I heard that, I'm not sure exactly who, but I think it was a Nobel prize winner. I could be completely wrong, that combining both of them together is kind of the ideal goal, but that again inflates the cost of the study so much that it's typically not done.
Right. I mean, if you're working with a new group, I didn't combine them in any specific analysis, but have both. Have one 24-hour recall to make sure you've got the recipes right and the portion sizes and all that, and then the food frequency. And then the food frequency can be calibrated. As long as you have the right foods, you can look back. And when I was developing it, I did that at first. I had a recall and an FFQ, and I realized that, what we were assuming is small, medium, and large needed to be adjusted. The recipe needed to be carefully included, because the Puerto Ricans, for example, will put tomato sauce in their beans. They put oil in their rice. If you don't know that and you use the standard rice cooked in water, they eat rice frequently and a lot of it. So if you don't know there's oil in it, you're missing the fat, you're missing the calories. If you don't know that there's tomato sauce in their beans, you're missing some of the lycopene. And we standardized that by, for example, measuring lycopene in the blood and realizing it was higher in the blood than it appeared in the diet. So we went back and checked the recipes and realized we had to put more tomato sauce in the beans and the chicken stew, and they put it in a lot of things. So it's an iterative process. It's never going to be final because things keep appearing. You have to add energy drinks because all of a sudden they're popular. You have to add energy bars. And you need to make sure all your subgroups are included. If you have vegetarians, you need to have, soy, and sometimes that's just entered very generally. But if you're really focusing on vegetarians, you need to have different kinds of gluten foods and all kinds of things. So it really is endless. And as of today, we've run up against limitations in technology where we can put all this effort in and design it for, the Puerto Ricans. A lot of other people have used my questionnaire now. It's being used in Puerto Rico. It's being used by others in the Northeast. The Jackson Hart's questionnaire is a Southern questionnaire, so it's being used by Tulane and it's being used by North Carolina. But if you're going to go to a new group, you have to design it. And so that's limiting us right now.
But I guess that was kind of my follow-up question. Like, what are the difficulties in sharing the accurate data collection or capturing specific food types and health metrics? And you kind of explained a lot of it, but is there one that kind of just stands out? I guess for me, my question is why are the researchers putting the recipes in and not having the folks say what the recipes are for their food items?
Yeah. So we do for the 24-hour recalls, we
Yeah,
have people give the recipes.
I see.
And so when we make assumptions on the recipes, because for the food frequency questionnaire, we
Yeah,
just ask in general. So
yeah,
what we do is we have weights behind it. If it says chicken soup, based on a set of 24-hour recalls, we would have the different types of chicken soup recipes and they're weighted, 80% of this and 40%, 20% of that. That will go into the nutrients for that item chicken soup. Now, it's not going to be linked to each individual person, but it's going to be good enough
yeah. No, it
and
is.
average over the whole population.
Yeah, that's what I
So
was gonna
that
say.
we do that for every line item. So if it's you know, beef dishes, there's certain kinds of beef dishes that are very popular and they would be weighted in there accordingly.
That makes total sense.
Mhm.
We got to do what we can, right, with our limited.
Yeah, to simplify it, because we can't keep people's interest to talk to them for 2 hours and get all the details on everybody and then enter it. So it is this compromise. But what I've always been wanting to do, and haven't gotten to that technological point yet, is get to the place where you can have one FFQ that can basically include everybody because it has the possibility of doing that. So you ask certain questions about their eating patterns. And if they're vegetarian, you don't have to ask them about any of the meat, right? You just automatically tailor the questionnaire for them. Or if they eat, Puerto Rican food and American food, the algorithm will include those foods and be complete. If you eat Indian food, they'll have that. Always with American food because everybody living here has a continuum of acculturation.
Yeah,
Some Puerto Ricans eat just like me, and others eat
very
just
different.
like in Puerto Rico. So you've got to have both for everything, and the same for any culture. Chinese, they're
Mhm.
going to be eating hamburgers as well as Chinese food. So you've got your American, but then if you have to integrate things in, the program will do it. And I've talked to different people who've been thinking about that, but so far that hasn't been created.
Oh, well,
But
that's an
that's the
opportunity.
goal. Yeah, that's an opportunity. That's the goal. It's a
Yeah.
lot of programming, but I think talking to engineers now, people working in AI, there are ways to do it. A lot of data, but then
Mm.
they can do all this in marketing. Why can't we do it in diet, right?
Oh, yes, 100%.
Yeah.
I did data science, so I'm very confident what you're describing could be done.
Mhm.
And in today's day and age, with the assistance of AI tools to assist with coding, like that's also sped
Right.
it all up. Like you could
Yep.
anticipate a project like this, at least an MVP, to prove if it works within a few months, or
Great.
after the
Yeah.
design has been done. Because I feel that's one thing people kind of overlook on all these tools that we have is
Mhm.
that no one cares really about the the fatigue that you get from using these studies. So you have
Right.
to design it in a way that it allows someone to keep engaging with it and also allows the researcher not have a tough time getting through all of it. So you have to look at two
Right.
different users, and many people just tend to focus on one or the other.
You're right. You're right. That's the balance. People, if your FFQ is too long, they'll start answering it, and then you'll get some pattern like yes, 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 yes. They just want to get through it.
Exactly, and then you start
Yeah.
to kind of numb yourself. You're not
Yeah,
paying
yeah. Well, you're losing your validity. Yep.
exactly.
So that's where we got to get that sweet spot of getting the right questions to the right people
Mhm.
and in a concise way and being able to consolidate it. And I am optimistic that we will get there because things are moving so fast
Hmm.
these days in technology. So
Absolutely. That was actually our upcoming question was if you could build anything, what would it be? And you
that's what it
answered it.
would be. I wanted to do that. I've proposed it even, but takes money
Yeah.
and it takes the technical expertise. There's a lot of
Mhm.
people interested. In fact, I've been contacted by several people trying to build things.
Mhm.
But it's about funding.
It is,
Yeah, you
unfortunately.
gotta get the money to do it. Mm.
Yeah. Um, so I guess that's also a great follow-up question is you've contributed so much to the field of nutritional epidemiology for so many years now. What are some improvements you've observed over time in the field as we assess diets?
Well, it's been really interesting. I mean, just thinking back to things as simple as understanding the day-to-day variability.
Mhm.
So that now, if you have two recalls and you know the intraperson individual variability between, comparing it within and the between variability, you can adjust the distribution of intake to account for that. And that has made it so much better, for example, in the national surveys, because before a single 24-hour recall, you're going to have extreme tails and you're going to overestimate people with low intake or high intake, which is one of their goals. With this new statistical method, you can pull in the distribution and get much more accuracy. And that's changed a lot about the way we analyze things. Another is understanding the importance of adjusting for energy and a food frequency because it does have average portion sizes. And so some people will eat more foods and some people will eat less foods, but bigger portions. And of course, men will be eating more than women, but just adjusting for sex doesn't do it. But there's been a lot of statistical proof that if you adjust for energy, on a food frequency, usually the nutrients distributions are more valid. Um, Technology, when I started, I did it all on in Panama. I wrote everything down
Yeah.
for the recall records, and then I entered it on this long green coding sheet with a number linked to the USDA. 108 was milk, and then grams are household units, and then 1/2 or a half a cup for every single food for every single person. Now we have programs where you just say milk and it gives you the options. Is it skim? Is it low? You say low. What's the portion size? Thing, boom, it's done.
Yeah.
So I have seen, I mean, I've had a long career, but I've seen tremendous improvements so that students don't realize how much work it used to be to get all these data in. And that obviously limited the size of your studies and what you could do. So it's just gotten so much better. And yeah, between the technology for data entry, the database with the nutrient assessment, which still has a way to go, but is excellent. And now the techniques to improve the questions. I'm very optimistic it's going to continue to move forward. I'm very happy that honestly, when I started, there was a lot of doubt about um, the importance of nutrition.
Mhm.
It's amazing, but people just weren't convinced. Doctors weren't convinced that what you ate mattered.
Yeah. Isn't that
Um,
insane?
and through the hard work that our field has done, I think we've proven so much about. Um, you know, we haven't spoken about diet patterns, but it's not just a single nutrient. You can find these single nutrient relationships, but it's the overall pattern. And so now we're getting to the point where we're making recommendations like the Mediterranean diet, for example. And then even with that, we need to tailor that for individual cultural
Yeah.
um,
Absolutely.
specifics. So there's a lot of work to be done,
Mhm.
but a lot of progress has been made.
Yeah, sounds like it. In fact, when you bring that up about, doctors finally agreeing that food is a thing that should be worried, it's still concerning that in hospitals, I just experienced a stay in one, and the food quality wasn't exactly what I expected. It was much lower
Yeah.
than I thought you would be trying to provide to folks who are trying to recover. And, they didn't really carry their necessarily. I think comfort food might have a huge factor in helping people recover,
Hmm.
especially if they're by themselves alone in a hospital room without family or friends.
Right.
And each culture is going to have their own type of comfort foods, but they tend to be somewhat similar, right? It's like greasy or something
Yeah.
else for each culture. And it's a shame that that hasn't been implemented yet. When you go to, at least I've seen
Well,
photos in other countries around the world, they
yeah.
provide very high quality food options. So I hope I hope that gets more of a standard pretty
Well,
soon.
it's a big fight, and I'll tell you what the big fight right now is school lunch
Yes.
because they have such little money to work with that,
Mhm.
when I went to school, there were lunch ladies in the kitchen cooking.
Yeah.
Now it's frozen dinners heated in a microwave.
Yeah.
So quality is a challenge. It's about money. It's
Mhm.
expensive. It's about time. But it's so important, and it's been, underestimated. It's always a fight again with Congress to
Yeah.
support nutrition programs, to support nutrition feeding for the elderly, for
Mhm.
the school lunch, for the daycare.
Yeah.
Um, it's just so important, and getting that word out there is
Huge.
my goal.
I think I saw a tweet just the other day that went viral where they said like it's an interesting litmus test. I think it was for the right term there, that whether somebody would say it's a problem to provide free food to kids, for
Yeah,
like, and whether you'd want to continue a conversation with that person or not.
I know who votes against that, but
Yeah,
they do.
people do. I
They
think
do.
if you, and my crazy take on this is that if you want Congress to pass something, you got to put it through the military. And I don't know any better way to argue that, hey, if you have kids who are malnourished, they're not going to make good soldiers, not going to make good defenders of the
Exactly.
country.
And honestly,
For the military budget.
honestly, that's how the RDA started.
Really? See, it's not a
It
bad
was
argument.
it was about the military. It was about how do we have our military men healthy, and that was the
Mhm.
start of making recommendations, and then it expanded to the whole population. So
I
it's
think we're
interesting
onto something here.
that you brought that up.
I hope it works that way, but that's what I've seen as a pattern. You got to get some military angle, and the funding goes through without a question.
Yeah, you're right.
But yeah, well, we have some more questions to get through here. So this is a fun one, especially with the research you've been doing. I know a lot of people are
Mhm.
interested in knowing this. Can you explain the role that genetic polymorphisms play in dietary responses and what potential you see for personalized nutrition? And if you don't mind explaining what genetic polymorphism are
Sure.
for folks, not
So
everybody, I don't have like
yeah.
full detailed information on that as well.
So the genes are made up of alleles, and th- they usually have a parent from two parents. And
Yeah.
so they will have something, a purine base. It may be called a T or a C, or, and then there's a usual pattern that dictates what that gene does.
Mhm.
Now, sometimes they'll get misplaced. And so you'll have a TT instead of a TC. And that may cause some kind of reaction in the body not to work right, or it may block something. In
Yeah.
severe cases, it can kill you. But most of them are much more minor than that. They in relation to nutrition, what they do, and a good example that a lot of people have heard of is the MTHFR mutation, where it's really methyl tetrahydrofolate reductase, and it's a gene that dictates how folate is processed in the body. And if you have this mutation, it's blocked so that you don't get the benefit, even though you're eating the same amount of folate. The good news is that if you have enough folate, you can overcome that mutation. And so it's so important to understand. That's just one example. There's all these mutations in fatty acid pathway metabolism. We've seen for example, one that I show from the Puerto Rican study is that if you're on a low-fat diet, what's called the wild type, or the most common form, is protective of your weight. But if you're on a high-fat diet, that the other mutation causes protection, and the standard mutation causes higher weight, because it's a matter of historical survival. And so, for example, a lot of populations that were hungry would have mutations that would help them keep on the weight.
See, so
Right. So now, and you get into a high fat, high calorie environment, those mutations that help you keep on the weight make it hard to lose the weight. So what was protective for the majority of that kind of population before is now harmful for the majority. And for example, is partially explaining why in this I just have my own example, but 80% of women have obesity in this population. And it's partly the genetic predisposition being placed in a modern diet. And so we have so much of that. So that what's exciting is that, first of all, as a nutritional epidemiologist, I realized that if you're mixing these polymorphisms and you're looking at the relationship between fat and weight, for example, you might not find anything because it has different effects in different groups.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
It may cancel it out. So that showed me that by having the genetic polymorphism information, we're going to be able to show the really true effects of nutrients on health outcomes, because they are not the same for everybody. Some people need more, some people need less, some people need more because they're eating other things. It's very complicated. But again, in the future, I have no doubt we will all have our genome read, and we'll have better nutrient scans. Right now it's very expensive to do each one, but we'll have better nutrient scans of our blood, and we'll know by putting those together how to advise an individual. Say you have the MTHFR polymorphism, you need more folate. You have this polymorphism, you really need to avoid saturated fat more than other people. And hopefully when we get all that information together, people will take it more seriously and believe it because it's about them.
No, it makes total sense. I guess if anyone's listening and is struggling with something, might as well get yourself tested genetically. If you're okay with sharing your DNA, you might find something you didn't know, and it could help. Knowledge is power. If you know something about yourself, you're able to adjust.
Right. Yes, I agree. At first with these, we do have DNA in our population, and some of it might show that you have an ApoE polymorphism. That means you're at greater risk of Alzheimer's. Interestingly, we found that the people we also have MRIs now, we found that the people with the ApoE4 allele, yes, they had worse cognitive outcomes, but the vitamins, the B vitamins and the omega-3 fatty acids were more protective for them than for the people without that allele. So again, a lot of these genetic things can be overcome with the right diet, but sometimes you need more than average to overcome them.
Yeah.
And so, as you said, first of all, you need the knowledge.
Exactly. Yeah. Without it, you wouldn't know what to do.
Exactly.
Okay.
So the future is coming. Yes.
It's almost here. I guess on the topic of knowledge, how do you think, we just had a recall yesterday on all this chicken. So how do you think agricultural practices in the US versus Europe might be influencing these diet-related disease risk or issues for folks down the line?
Yeah. Well, Europe's had its own problems with contaminated food or things in the past. But yeah, it's big agriculture. Now we have to revisit how we're growing animals. And if we're crowding them into tight conditions, and we're slaughtering them and mixing them all together, they're more likely to be contaminated. And so we've been having a lot of recalls, not only on the animal products, but even on vegetables, which is this hard name to find
Absolutely.
bacteria, vegetables.
Yeah.
But it's it's a matter of trying to keep our food safe. Food safety is a very important thing, and the bigger the agriculture, the more likely the risk. In terms of Europe, they are, at least France, I'm familiar with, and Spain are much more protective of their food. So they limit, they even GMOs, genetically modified organisms, they limit what can be used there. And so the US does not limit that. Um, I'm working with phosphorus compounds, which I'm finding to have a negative effect on health. And yeah, and they're added to everything like bread, and they're, emulsifiers, dough softeners. I started out by finding a relationship between cola and bone, phosphoric acid in cola with no other nutrients to balance it.
Like
Right.
Coca-Cola?
Coca-Cola consumed frequently without other food. You
Mhm.
have this surge in phosphorus in the blood,
Yeah, okay.
pulls calcium out of the bone. This is
Yeah,
associated
yeah.
with osteoporosis. So just just realize in studying this that we have no limit on these compounds
That's
in our
really
food,
concerning.
but Europe has limits
Yeah,
on
wow,
what
okay.
should be added. So I think it's part of the American way of favoring business
Mhm.
um,
Overregulation.
over health, unless it's
Mhm.
something critical and immediate.
Mhm.
And I think that, again, we have to keep advocating for more public health
Mhm.
concerns.
Absolutely. I guess I have two follow-up questions on that topic. First of all,
Mhm.
is this the same phosphorus? It's been a while, that's found in like the volcanic ashes, or is it something else?
Oh, phosphorus is phosphorus, but it's a mineral. But
Yeah.
we have phosphates and phosphoric acid, and
Oh,
these
the acids, okay.
compounds, yeah, phosphoric acid and phosphate. You'll see anything like that, triphosphate, something, look on the labels, you'll see a lot of it.
Hmm.
Um, Unfortunately, they also added in solutions to fish and meat in the deli counter to make them look plumper and fresher.
Oh, okay.
That's another source.
I guess I bring it up.
Bread, major, the softer and fluffier the bread,
Oh
the more
man.
goes in it, right? Because
Okay.
homemade bread is going to be denser,
Hmm.
but those things soften it, whiten it, all of that.
So I guess the reason I bring it up is because their face masks, like volcanic ash face masks, that might have the phosphorus. Would that be because you mentioned that it's a whole
Yeah,
thing,
no,
so
I
I just want to
wouldn't.
make sure people don't panic or anything like that. It's mostly just the food, right? Like
It's no,
consuming it.
no, it's a mineral, and actually it's a required mineral. We
Mhm.
need it. It's just when it's out of relationship to its natural form or its
Mhm.
balance as an ion with other things.
Uh-huh.
If it's on its own in excess, then it gets released into the blood in excess, and then it causes things
Okay.
to change. But no, I wouldn't worry about the face mask. No,
Yeah, we don't want to send people to panic.
no, no.
No. No. So, and I guess the second question I had was, uh, I'd love to get confirmation on this, but not confirmation. First, the part confirmation. When we eat meat,
Hmm.
I heard that the amino acids in the meat kind of go towards building our own amino acids. Is that a true concept?
Yes,
Okay, so if that's the
exactly.
case, then
You
like
need all the amino acids in order
yeah,
to build your muscle and build your protein, and meat has a complete set of amino acids. That's something that vegetarians need to pay attention to. They can get complementary amino acids from
mhm,
things like grains and beans,
mhm,
um, or rice and beans, corn and beans. Those are traditional dishes for a reason.
yeah.
They give you the full complement of amino acids.
There's
Yeah.
a reason we've been eating it for so long. And I
Oh,
guess the second follow-up would be then, we talked about the animals or and the agricultural practices. So they're going through a lot of stress, and that builds up cortisol in their body. So does that mean, and this hasn't been necessarily proven in study, and that's why I'm asking you, and you can give an
Yeah.
unofficial supporting statement or unsupporting statement. Do you think that the the cortisol that's being built up in their bodies could be absorbed by us as we're eating it, which could lead to health complications to us, just like we absorb the amino acids?
That's an excellent question. And honestly, I've never thought about that. I think that I'm tending to doubt that that is quite that simply absorbed and
Yeah.
driven by our cortisol, but I really don't know the answer to that.
Well, if anyone listening wants to conduct a study on that, there's something
But
here.
I do know that the stressing of the beef reduces the quality of meat.
It does reduce the quality. That's what Kobe beef is. They're like treated
Yeah.
like gods, right?
It's really, yeah.
Massaged and
And
everything.
it's not only that, but I'm more concerned about the animal welfare.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah, we shouldn't be stressing them and we shouldn't be crowding them. And
No, it doesn't make sense, but
yeah,
it's unfortunate that the economics have caused such a situation. Regulations are essentially the free hand market has done its job.
right.
Regulation needs to step in. It's
Profit, profit, profit.
profit,
Yeah.
profit. Um, so I guess looking towards the future, and I guess this is a good
Hmm.
turning point. What is the area of dietary research you think the most attention or innovation, and what are you most hopeful about in the field?
Yeah, I think the personalized nutrition. I think that getting all the tools to link everything together. We also, in addition to our basic dietary data, we now have metabolomics, we have proteomics, we have, we're measuring all kinds of things. The metabolomics, we're linking with foods and outcomes, and showing, that helps us prove or brings us closer to proof that the food is causing the outcome because we can see the metabolic pathways enriched when they're eating more of this food. So we're learning more about there's lipidomics. There's so many things. There's so much data that in the future we're going to be able to analyze simultaneously, whereas until this point we've had to look at it piece by piece by piece. And so including the DNA, including better dietary questionnaires that are more inclusive, and new statistical algorithms. I think we're going to be able to prove to more people how important nutrients are and how important, and the other side of it is how negative all these additives are in our food supply.
Dr. Daly, who I was working with, his focal point was not necessarily focal point, like his also question was the additives. And I think that's just
Yeah.
become my concern across the industry.
Mm-hmm. And that's why right now in the field, there's a focus on what they call ultra processed foods.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not only that when they process them, a lot of nutrients are lost,
Mm-hmm.
like in white bread versus whole grain bread,
Yeah.
but also that all these additives, like those phosphorus compounds, are added. So you're getting less nutrition and more additives that are putting things out of balance.
Mm-hmm.
And it's pretty clear that over the past few years, everybody's looking at these ultra processed foods, and they clearly are related to poor health outcomes. So we need to get back to real food, high quality food, and more understanding of its importance.
Absolutely. I'll just add a little anecdote in there. I was at a GI convention last year, and many of the GI doctors were discussing a concern that they're seeing patients that are much younger, much younger than the recommended guideline for a colonoscopy. And,
Yeah,
they wanted to bring it down all the way if they could to like 25 and 30, but obviously insurance companies would be like, that's too much. That's a ton of
right.
appointments that we have to cover. So they negotiated and brought it down, I think 5 years just recently they
Mhm.
passed that. But that only goes to show if the doctors wanted it that low,
Right.
maybe if you're feeling you have GI issues as a listener, go check it
Yeah,
out. It could be something that's causing it for you.
absolutely. And there's no doubt that GI colon cancer is one of the most diet-related cancer.
Mm-hmm.
It's the refined diet, the low fiber, the processed meats that have chemicals, and then obesity. And that's a bad combination. And so that's why I believe we're seeing it in younger people, because they're eating such really terrible processed, ultra processed diets.
Taco Bell, it's delicious, but we can't be eating it all the time.
Exactly. You can eat anything occasionally, but living on fast food is really, really not good for you.
Awesome. We're near the end here. I guess I kind of like one last question. So,
Mhm.
um, given your incredible career and the impact you've had on your research, on like addressing health disparities, how do you hope to inspire the next generation of researchers, and what advice would you give to them that are working at the intersection of nutrition, genetics, and public health?
That's an excellent question, because I do have junior colleagues and graduate students that
Hmm.
I am concerned about this. Um, and what I tell them is that, one of the things you need to do to be successful in this field is to keep learning. The way you've learned to do analysis changes. I had none of this complex analysis in my training, but you have to learn it as you grow with the problem. You need to advocate for the importance of diet and public health, both for better school meals and better food quality for the public, but also more funding for our research. Um, and you need to tailor the approaches to the most vulnerable group. Earlier research was really honestly all about white men, and the Congress cared about that. The first grant I ever submitted for Puerto Ricans, they said, why would they be any different? Not understanding anything about the different diet, the cultural differences, the different risk. But now the NIH has come around, and like I said, they're focusing much more on health disparities. So it's all good.
That's, that's fantastic advice, and I hope we keep improving as a society in researching for everybody. That's really, really important.
Exactly.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Tucker, for coming on to Research Base U. We have been incredibly excited to have you for so long, and now that you're here, you gave us a fantastic episode, and I hope our listeners also enjoyed it. Thank you so much for coming on.
It's been a real pleasure speaking with you. Thank you.
Thank you. All right. Bye bye.